beginning at verse 21, and we'll read that text in just a moment. It has to do with the cities of Tyre and Sidon, maybe less familiar to us than the city of Sychar there in Samaria. But the city of Tyre at one time was a part of the tribe of Asher, but long since lost to paganism. It was a part of the things that had captured its heart. There were only two things that Tyre especially was noted for. One of those was it was a seafaring port. It's Phoenicia, if you're thinking about the historical period. Well, looky there. It's a miracle, Ted, almost. And you never saw a sermon go so fast, did you there? Okay. 3 surprise visits. We're in Tyre and Sidon, and you'll see on the map an arrow indicating that this is up on the coast, Mediterranean Sea, on the far northwest side of what we think of as Palestine. Well, it was known for its sailors, and it was known for this dye. It was a purplish red dye, and it was drawn from the internal parts of snails. And it was well marketed. It was what the city of Tyre was famous for at the time of Christ. But the city was also highly paganized. I said at one time it had been a part of the tribe of Asher and therefore would have known something of Jehovah, but by now it worships Ashtaroth, Baal, Beelzebub, especially Eshban. I want you to remember Eshban because Eshban was the Canaanite god of healing. And what Jesus is going to perform in this miracle we're going to read about in this city of Tyre, or at least in the district around Tyre, is going to certainly be an outstanding, superior act to what their god Eshban was able to do. Josephus, who's a Jewish historian who wrote in the first century, said, "Among Phoenicians and Tyrians are notoriously our bitterest enemies." So by the middle of the end of the first century, the Jewish historian would say, if you're trying to identify the source of the enemies of Jewish people, it has to do with folks who are in this corner up here that are Phoenicia, that are in the city of Tyre. Why would Jesus go there? Why would it take a part of his journey and his itinerary to go? Well, it's possible that Jesus is still seeking that place of rest where he can debrief his disciples. They've been out on their commission. The times that they've wanted to find rest, the crowds were so intense they couldn't, and they just continued doing miracles and teaching. So maybe this was a place he didn't think he would get many speaking engagements. It'd be a place to rest, to debrief the disciples. There was also, the last thing you've been reading in the text, some attacks mounting against Jesus. His enemies are beginning to become more vociferous. And so it may have to do with the safety issue to avoid growing threats. Or it may just be, as a part of an intentional itinerary, that Jesus is about to share one of those great object lessons for which he's known. The last thing he's been talking about is about the individual's heart. That it's not the fleshly side, but it is the individual's heart that directs the choices between righteous behavior and unrighteous behavior. And what better setting than to go into a place that is almost the center of unrighteousness and to share a message of godliness? Well, listen at this text as we read it from Matthew chapter 15, beginning at verse 21. Just a few comments as we share the story of this Canaanite woman. Jesus went away from there, withdrew into the district of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." She's described in Mark's account as being a Syro-Phoenician. In other words, ancestral blend between Syria and this Phoenician territory. He did not answer a word. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, "Send her away because she keeps shouting at us." But he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now I've wondered, does he say that initially to her, or is that how he's responding to his disciples? Because that's how their commission had been. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered and said, "It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." This, by the way, is not the Greek word that they used when they were antagonizing each other, saying, "You dogs." This is the word for a house pet, a house puppy to be exact. And she says, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from the master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at once. The marvelous healing power of Jesus, demonstrated in a cultural setting, in a geographic location that wasn't Jerusalem, that wasn't Galilee, but out here into pagan territory of the Canaanites, and dealt with an individual who shows such great faith. Did you notice in reading the text that 3 times she calls him Lord, and once she bows down before him? Jesus can't get his own disciples to understand that much, but here this woman does. Well, the third unusual visit that I want us to see is an even more familiar one to us, and it's just a chapter over. If you have your Bibles open there in Matthew, you go to chapter 16, and Jesus is going to go to the city of Caesarea Philippi. Now, again, the story is familiar to us because crossing over about 40 miles to the east, we're going to have Jesus ask this question of his disciples. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, well, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Indeed, one of the most remarkable, familiar events in Jesus' ministry. The confession that Peter makes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He acknowledges both his messiahship with the word Christ, and he acknowledges his deity as being the Son of the living God. But what is intriguing to me here is not so much the familiar event, it's where it takes place. I might expect Jesus to have sought for Peter's proclamation on the steps of the temple in Jerusalem, or maybe at the headquarters of their mission work coming out of Capernaum, or at least some highly respected city of the Jews. No, it takes place in Caesarea Philippi. Now, when I say it was a center of emperor worship, that's not quite like it is when you read another 50 years into the future and you have emperor worship that's taking place in Revelation 2 and 3, and where there are literally dedicated temples to the emperors. But Philip, who was the son of Herod the Great, had become the tetrarch over this territory in this northern area north of Palestine. And he renamed the city Caesarea Philippi. Philippi honoring himself as Philip, but also honoring Caesar, the Emperor Tiberius at the time. Maybe it was hoping to gain a little favor. It certainly was an honor to have a city named after you. But I emphasize that because the very name, by saying Caesarea Philippi, was highlighting the Roman authority, was highlighting the Roman emperor. It was the place of a location known as the grotto or the cave of Pan. Pan was a Canaanite goat god, which I find it's the picture off on the far left as I'm looking at the screen. A goat god. But this was one of their fertility gods, and in that place there was a great pit inside they thought it was bottomless, that it had no end, and it's where their fertility gods and goddesses came and wintered. When everything looked like it was dead and awaiting for the spring rebirth, that's where they would stay, was in this deep pit in there. And it actually had a sign in there that was called the Gate of Hades. Interesting note, when Peter goes ahead with his confession in chapter 16, verse 16, Jesus ultimately says, the gates of Hades will not prevail against my kingdom. I think he's almost pointing over at that site that they knew was there. But Caesarea Philippi was a hotbed of paganism, of idol worship. Mount Hermon, that's going to be only a few miles on to the northeast, one of the highest mountain peaks, many believe was where the transfiguration of Jesus is going to take place. In the next chapter, in Matthew 17, was the abode of El, who was certainly not the El associated with God of the Bible, but was their pagan god. He lived up in Mount Hermon. Why would Jesus go there for this particular event? Well, I've raised those questions so that I can make two crucial applications for us. The first of those is we have to, in our own lives, overcome those prejudices which close doors of ministry. The disciples probably didn't want to travel through Samaria, but Jesus knew they needed not only to travel through Samaria, but they needed to meet the Samaritan woman. They needed to stop by Jacob's well. They need to spend some time there. He knew that they needed to understand that a Canaanitish woman could be a woman of faith, who could say the word Lord as well as they could. He knew that they needed to observe that Caesarea Philippi could be a place where the proclamation of the deity and the messiahship of Jesus Christ could be sounded out loud and clear. As much as I would like to think I don't have any prejudices, the honesty of looking in my own spiritual mirror says otherwise. Prejudices are born from our own previous experiences, some things that we were taught, some ways we were raised, some things we see in the media. But our minds begin to be shaped where we prejudge individuals on superficial things, whether it has to do with skin color or the part of town that they live in, whether it has to do with what country, what city they live in. And we begin to make sweeping generalities about people. Some of them may be somewhat accurate, but are never completely accurate because it keeps us from looking at the hearts of people. A Samaritan woman, a Canaanitish lady, or the people living in Caesarea Philippi. When Peter comes to the house of Cornelius, the light bulb kind of comes on, and he begins to see things differently. And opening his mouth, Peter said, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality, but in every nation, the man who fears him and does what is right is welcome to him. On a different issue, the socioeconomic issue in James chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, if, however, you're fulfilling the royal law, according to Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you're doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. In other words, partiality or prejudice is not just a kind of a bad habit that you ought to kind of work on. He says you're committing sin. And Jesus makes these three surprise visits, if you will, I think to help you and me today to understand we have to battle against those prejudices, our attitudes that look down at people, that pigeonhole individuals, that allow us to see, go into all of the world and preach the gospel to every creature, to be as universal within our own communities, our own associations, as it is in places that we put folks on airplanes and send them overseas for. The second crucial message is we need to be alert to people more than the culture that surrounds them. Sometimes the least promising situations yield the best results. Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman. She goes off and tells folks about what it is he's just revealed to her. And they come back to listen to Jesus. And when they listen to Jesus, they ask him to stay. And he stays 2 days with them in Sychar. Who would have thought, which one of the 12, as they run off into town to buy food and leave Jesus resting at the well, would have ever thought that that was going to turn into an evangelistic opportunity, that was going to turn into a gospel-telling event? Because Jesus is actually going to reveal to her in verses 25 and 26 that I am the Messiah. And that momentous event took place in the midst of Samaria, because Jesus was able to be alert to people more than the culture around them. Jesus wasn't turned off by the culture of Tyre or the culture of Caesarea Philippi to such an extent that he couldn't see the people who were there and the events that needed to take place. And my hope is that as you and I come to see Jesus and his journeys and his ministries and his activities, yes, it's great when he was in Jerusalem and Cana, as we read about in the miracle in John 2. But equally as impressive, maybe even more impressive because of the backdrop, the surprise visits of Jesus make me want to make some surprise visits, to go to some places that might seem uncomfortable, to talk to some people who might seem unwelcoming, to be able to battle my own heart issues so that I come to love all people as those created in the image of God, and therefore compelled to share the good news of Jesus. I said 3, but you know there's actually one other surprise visit that Jesus made. And he made it especially for you, and he made it especially for me. It was when he went to the cross. Now, it wasn't a surprise to Jesus any more than Samaria and Tyre and Caesarea Philippi were surprises. It was all a part of God's plan. It was a part of the itineraries. But it's even more surprising that Jesus would go those other places, that he would go to the cross for you and for me, for our shortcomings and our struggles, our departures, our waywardness, our attitudes. Jesus died for you, and he died for me. This morning, as we sing our invitation hymn that says, "O heart bowed down with sorrow." You can have a lot of different sorrows in life. They can come because of losses. They can come because of anxieties. But they can come because of sin that we have in our lives. And this morning, the invitation of Jesus is to come to him, and he offers forgiveness, cleansing. You're in this audience as a physical part of our assembly today, and you need to respond to the invitation of Jesus, maybe to be baptized, maybe to have prayer. Whatever it is that you need and your heart is bowed down with sorrow, Jesus is inviting you to come. As we say to all of those who listen and watch with us online, we're as close as that phone call to be able to share a request and share prayer, whatever blessing it is that you need. But as we stand and sing this hymn, would you respond to the unexpected visit of the cross for you and for me while we stand and sing?